Hi, everybody. This is your boy, Digital Don AV. Welcome to my live stream. Tonight, I've got a special guest, a really good friend of mine, Aaron from Aaron's Audio Corner. Great dude, super knowledgeable. We're going to roll up our sleeves a little bit and talk about some things. So sit back. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the show and welcome my boy, Aaron from Aaron's Audio Corner. How you doing, brother?
I'm good, man. How are you?
The man, the myth, the legend. I mean, you've become, dude, I met you when you were just kind of getting started out in this, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
that's true. Yeah.
yeah,
was
a
good.
while back. And we got to have dinner and break bread and got to meet your kick-ass girlfriend. And
Yeah.
it was a good time. And it's been really cool just watching you explode, dude. You know, you're kind of a audio celebrity now a little bit, man.
In the YouTube world, I think if you have a channel, you're kind of an audio celebrity, but
well, yeah,
I do appreciate the sentiment.
No, is it, we were talking about this the other day. Is it been a little bit strange, people coming up to you, recognizing you, wanting to take a picture, your autograph?
No,
I haven't my baby. Will you please bless the measurements, baby?
Yeah, no, it was only weird when somebody asked me to sign their forehead because they were going to get it tattooed in place. That was the only weird one. Other than that, everything else has been completely normal. No, actually, I have not had anyone come up to me out of the blue. The only time people know me is at an audio show, which that's cool. Like, that's kind of what you expect. That's where if you're going to be noticed anywhere, that's where it's going to be. But one day I hope to hit 100K because that 6-digit number, I'm getting kind of
right
close
there.
But then when that happens, I can tell my daughter, like, hey, your dad's got 100,000 subscribers. And she might think that's cool. Cause for the most part, she's like, I did this Godzilla type intro on one of my recent videos and I sent it to her and she said, I can't remember her exact wording. She's 14. She said something to the effect of, we need to talk about your social media impact or imprint. And I was like, oh, snap. So
yeah, it's pretty funny. My daughter's 17 and a half and she's in, she's typical kid age. She's in theater class and all that. And she's like, Dad, you're kind of becoming an influencer. I'm like, a bad influencer, at that. It's just weird. Isn't that a weird term? You're an influencer.
Oh yeah. I struggle with like, do I like having that term put on me or not? Because sometimes it can be such a negative connotation. It's like, I just want to be thought of like as somebody that people trust, and not necessarily I'm going to influence your decision as much as it's just to inform you, but I guess there's a line there.
I think you're doing a great job of that. I mean, you really are. You've kind of, and there's some other forums and stuff that do measurements, and we're going to dive into what you do and how you measure, but you do objective and you do subjective. And I think that's cool because if you only go by objective, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. And I think you would agree with that. I think we all need to see and listen to speakers, right, to a point. All right, man, let's get into it. Tell me, tell everybody a little bit about your background.
Let's see here. My background. So that's Michael Jackson, Thriller. That's Fleetwood Mac, Rumors.
Right. Nobody needs a smart ass, Aaron.
This is my two favorite albums of all time.
Tears for Fears.
Tears for Fears and Dire Straits. Yep. But for what it's worth, those are the MoFi versions. Those are the remastered versions, which are actually good remasters. No, in all seriousness, so my background is I don't even know where to start. I guess we'll just make it more recent. Questions like this always put me on the spot. I'm like, how do I answer this? You ever go to a job interview, and they're like, tell us why we should hire you. And you're like, oh, I don't know. Like, you're the one who put out the rec. I just showed up. So like everybody, it's a love of music first and foremost, right? So I can remember being little, driving around with my mom, listening to Casey and the Sunshine Band, Lionel Richie, Michael Jackson, all the stuff that was popular back in the 80s when I was growing up. So I was born in 82. So I'm 42. And as I went through high school, again, I went through my metal phase, my country phase, and all that stuff. And I just kind of carried that over to car audio. And when I got my first car audio system, pretty much like everybody else, you get subwoofers. And then if you stay with it long enough, you start upgrading other things like your tweeters and your door speakers and all of that. Well, that led into me getting into the DIY side of car audio, which more or less was kind of taking raw drivers. Instead of going to Best Buy and buying Kenwood speakers or Alpine speakers, you go to Matasound speaker store and you buy Tang Band, Vifa, Scanspeak, SB Acoustics, those kind of brands, and you put them in your car and you try to make them work. And from there, I really wanted to understand why some things worked better than others, but I also wanted to understand how, like, mainly when you start off in car audio and you build your own subwoofer enclosure, you need to understand TS parameters, the field small parameters. And I really wanted to understand how manufacturers were coming up with these excursion values. Like, hey, we can hit 9mm one way. And then you find out that, yeah, you can hit 9mm one way, but that's right before the voice coil gets thrown outside of the magnet, right? So I started testing for DIY mobile audio using a Klippel. Now, it's not the same Klippel near field scanner that I use. Klippel is the company, and they make all sorts of stuff. So this device was their distortion analyzer. And what you can do is you use a laser, you mount a drive unit in like a fixture and basically hold it in place. You use the laser to measure excursion, and it will tell you at this point it exceeds some kind of linear threshold, THD based, 10% or 20%, depending on what you're testing. And then I tested a speaker, didn't give it a really good review. The manufacturer got a hold of the guy who owned the website. The guy who owned the website asked me to take the review down, and I said no, and then I quit reviewing for them. Now, I was never paid to review for them to begin with, and I thought, why should I, like, I'm just doing the community kind of a solid here by providing the measurements. So you go find somebody else to do this for you. And then about 6 months later, I reached out to Klippel. I started getting my own stuff from them, and I started using a website called medleysmusings.com, which is a stupid name, but that's kind of a play on my name. I posted raw driver measurements from, again, DIY type drivers up to car audio speakers. And I did that for a while. Then I took a break for a while. Then COVID hit, and I thought, I saw some videos from certain people, and I thought, I could fill a niche here where I don't just talk about subjective, but I can also do objective reviews, because I'd already been doing it for about 10 years anyway. So that just kind of led one thing to another. I started reviewing loudspeakers instead of just raw drivers. The way I wanted to review loudspeakers was per the CTA 2034 standard specification. And from there, it would take me 12 to 15 hours per speaker to measure, because you have to measure 70 measurements around it and then 70 measurements above and below it and to the back of it. It took me a long time to do all that, process the data, and because I did all that manually. So then I switched over to using Klippel's near field scanner, which automates that portion of my process. And I just, built my YouTube channel off of doing subjective and objective reviews, more leaning toward the objective, because personally, that's what I put more weight in terms of listening to others' feedback. Like, if I'm going to go to a review, if they've got data, I'm probably just going to skip whatever they think they heard, and I'm going to look at the data and make an assessment myself based on that. But I have the luxury of having tested hundreds of speakers at this point, so I know how to read the data. So the way that I give my reviews is I talk about some brief information about what I heard in the speaker, and then I spend time talking about, okay, this is where things kind of align with the measurements, and I use the data to help you have an understanding of what's the best way to position the speakers off the wall, near the wall, how should you aim them, where should you sit, what's the SPL capability, and things of that nature. And that's hopefully it in a nutshell. That's where I'm at.
That's super cool. In talking to you, off camera, we both kind of started in car audio, and being an integrator in the industry I'm in, a lot of guys started in car audio, and some of the best integrators started in car audio, because when you're in a car audio as deep as you were and as I was, I started off the same way. I wanted 15s and I wanted 18s, and it was about bass. But then that, RTA meters were introduced and EQs, and then we started working on sound quality and doing separate amps and, different kinds of crossovers and whatnot. So I think a lot of people, OGs in the industry, kind of started off in that. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions, and let's try to articulate this to the audience in a way that they understand it which I think you do a great job. I think your explanation of on and off access and the charts that you put up are very helpful. Okay, they're really, really helpful, because a lot of people, I don't think, truly understand. They just go, the measurements. I don't think they really, that's just the nature of people.
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I do it myself. So yeah, I hear you.
to do that. So, what would you say in a nutshell, speaker measurements are important, and how do they affect what we hear?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a whole science, decades worth of research that kind of goes into it, and I won't bore everybody with that. But essentially, what was discovered was that there's a strong correlation between a certain type of frequency response, both on and off axis, and how people like one type of response over another. And so this was all rooted in subjective blind listening tests. So people would listen to these speakers and then they would go back and forth between multiple speakers. They were part of a panel. And then the subjective portions will be kept up with on a sheet, like how do you think this thing sounds, et cetera, and all the attributes that go with what you think a speaker sounds like and what you enjoy. So these people would rank them. And then the researchers would go and say, well, here's the measurements. And what we're finding is the speakers that are ranked the highest have these objective attributes. And essentially what that boils down to is a speaker that is flat on axis and then with a slope, a nice linear slope off axis. And this is anechoic data that I'm talking about, not in room. There's a lot of confusion that I see out there where some will state the fact that, well, I heard this speaker in my room and it measured flat, but I hated the way it sounds. So when you take a flat anechoic response speaker and you put it in a room, the response changes, and for a multitude of reasons. And I've got a whole video on that. So I want to make sure that people understand that flat anechoic without echo is not the same thing as flat in-room response. And ideally, you do not want a flat in-room response because that's going to sound very thin on the bass and very bright to your ears in the high frequency. Yeah. So I don't know if I answered that enough, but that's
it's great.
Yeah, that's kind of the baseline of it.
Simple to the point, the basic, and I think that's what people need to hear. When you're measuring a speaker, or if say somebody's looking to buy a set of speakers, they don't understand all this, but they're educating themselves on the internet. They're watching YouTubers, they're reading reviews and whatnot. It's a lot of stuff to digest.
Right.
What do you think the key measurements for them to look for if you're just a consumer coming on and you want to buy a new set of speakers?
Right. Well, the one thing I would caution people to do, and I've done this myself, and so truthfully, I'm still learning my audience, and I'm still trying to adapt to providing the audience what they need, what they're wanting, but also what they need, because sometimes you don't know what you need. And I know it sounds, now saying it out loud, I'm like, well, does that sound like egotistical of me to assume that I know what my audience needs? But I think, yeah, to a degree, it does make sense. And I say that based on feedback and things that I've seen people take away. Sometimes I'll make a video explicitly about a topic and I can hammer home the exact same statement 5 times. And I'll look in the comments and somebody will have completely misinterpreted what I've said. So I'll run into that. I would caution people to not take data in a vacuum. And the reason for that is because speakers are very, very complex. If you just ignore all the other attributes such as dynamic range, which can be measured, transients, which I believe can be measured via step response or impulse response, distortion, which can be measured, and you just kind of boil it down to frequency response, and you try to use that to help you determine the total balance of the speaker, so to speak, then a little bit of a dip here or a little bit of a dip there can sound different enough from another speaker that for the most part looks linear, but has a little bit of a dip somewhere else and a little bit of a peak somewhere else. And those things can be different enough to make it obviously sound like a different speaker. But then there's also the way that a speaker radiates sound. So if you take an example of, and I use this often, Klipsch's horn speakers typically radiate pretty narrowly, which means that there's not a lot of reflections going out into the room. And its hemisphere is maybe like plus or minus 30 degrees. So a total of 60 degrees wavefront coming out of the horn. But then you compare that with a standard, a two-way speaker with a mid-woofer and a tweeter on a flat baffle. Those will radiate more widely. You're talking about plus or minus 60, so 120 degrees hemispherical, and up until about 8K, and then it starts to narrow up. So if you took EQ and you use DSP to EQ the on-axis response to be exactly the same, those speakers are going to still sound completely different because you're listening in a room and you've got reflections. And then you got to consider the distance left from the speaker off the wall. That matters. How small is your room? So how reflective is your room going to be? There are all sorts of things to consider. And that's why I caution people not to take the data in a vacuum. I think it makes sense if you're just looking at it on its own to say, yeah, this speaker is wildly nonlinear. So in terms of accuracy, it's just really poor. But this other speaker, even though it's not flat, you're not going to ever have one that measures perfectly flat. Even with DSP, you're still within like half a decibel or so of tolerance. It doesn't have to be perfectly flat to still be accurate enough. So there's that aspect. But I encourage people more often than not to look at the data. And if you've heard that speaker, try to see if you can make sense of what the data is showing you and what you heard, and then use that for comparison purposes. You can say, yeah, when I listen to the speaker, it sounded bright. And then the measurements may show, a tilted up high frequency response. And you say, well, that makes sense. Or maybe you think a speaker sounds warm, and maybe there's a knot somewhere between like 1 to 3K or something like that. That might sound warm, or that might sound depth, like it sounds more deep. If there's a bump around 1K, it might sound like it's forward. So there are different ways that you can use to describe the sound of a speaker based on data. And I see this a lot. If you just take the time to Google EQ cheat sheets for producers, you'll see all sorts of information out there from different production websites that will say, if you want the speaker to sound more full, bump, I don't know, 120 hertz. If you want to do this, then do this thing and do this thing. And that's on the production side. And that definitely tracks to how we hear when we listen to a reproduction system. The other thing too is that if you want to make comparisons, the easiest thing to just consider is, you want a speaker that has lower bass extension in your room. You're going to put both speakers in the exact same position. So you've got speaker A that rolls off at 80 hertz. You've got speaker B that rolls off at 50 hertz. If you want deeper bass extension, you get speaker B, right? So it could be that simple, or it can be as complex as you want to make it.
Yeah, that's super cool. So back in the day, it's all I got, man. I got to go back to back in the day. But when we were doing theaters in the late 90s and early 2000s, we had mainly THX certified speakers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there was a plethora of them. And the THX speakers at the time, it's the original spec. It was, wasn't the newer specs. They had a very focused, controlled dispersion, specifically to avoid room interaction.
Yeah,
because there wasn't a lot of people doing acoustic treatments and whatnot. But what we found is how different they behaved in different rooms when we put them in there, the same speaker, because you tend to stay with the same kind of speaker.
right.
And just the dispersion on the musicality and 2-channel, they just sounded terrible. They never did. So when we would do a theater with a more audiophile based speaker, like some B&Ws, Matrix or whatever brand it was a whole different experience. But then you had a lot more room interaction that we had to deal with. But in 2-channel, that room interaction added to it.
For sure.
Do you think that, and I've talked to a lot of speaker designers, I'm friends with a bunch of them. I know a lot of them like to sprinkle in their own flavor onto that, which might measure as a dip or a peak here. Well, they do, they do. And you measure that.
For sure.
What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is everybody's goal to try to make a completely linear speaker, or are people trying to design a speaker that might sound better in different rooms? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, it depends on the manufacturer, right? So some manufacturers are shooting for a very accurate sound, and other manufacturers are shooting for something a little bit different, right? So I'm very well aware of brands that do not shoot for perfect accuracy. They've told me themselves, yeah, we're definitely doing this thing to impart some kind of coloration in the response because we want it to sound this certain way. And kind of interesting little side note is not all manufacturers stick with their own sound going from model to model. So you can see a manufacturer may have a completely different tonal balance for one speaker, and then the other speaker is another completely different tonal balance. So it's hard to get a grasp on that as a consumer, because you're thinking, oh, well, I like the way this speaker sounded from this manufacturer. So if I get this one, it's more expensive. It probably just has better components, but it's probably going to still sound kind of the same. I just better, right? And then it sounds completely different and you're at a loss. You don't know how to describe that. So that's one area why I think data can certainly help you. But yeah, I mean, definitely manufacturers will flavor or season a little bit of their speaker's response. Yeah, you run into that often. I think it really comes down to, and I do subscribe to the thought and the school of what Floyd Toole and Sean Olive's research has showed us is that people prefer, if you ABX blind test a speaker, people typically prefer a more neutral speaker, a more accurate speaker, right? When people see the speaker, or when there's some kind of nostalgia or some kind of emotion attached to the speaker, or just an aesthetic of the speaker that they like, then your brain steps in and it just goes crazy. It just goes haywire, and it starts making you hear things differently than you would if you had no idea what you were listening to. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have the right to enjoy what you enjoy. But I think for me personally, the problem comes into play when people start assigning those psychoacoustic attributes and their fondness of a speaker to what other people should or should not buy, right? And I know that may sound kind of contrary to me saying, as an objective oriented reviewer, that I'm saying you should buy this speaker because it's linear. And it's not so much that, it's, hey, here's what the speaker is doing, here's what you can expect, and if you're hearing this thing, then this is probably why, right? So I think that's the best way for me to review a speaker, and not necessarily as a pass or fail. And I used to kind of do that, and I don't know if it's that I've softened up, or if it's really that in order to try to get people to understand how the data is useful, you don't need to say, well, this speaker is crap and this speaker is the only one you should buy. You say, here's what these speakers are doing. And typically what people prefer is the speaker that's more linear. But if you have the speaker, then relate it to these measurements, and now you have a better understanding of what you're listening to. And I'll leave it up to you to decide to buy whatever you want. I mean, I made a joke about this on a recent live stream. Klipsch Heresy 4 is one of the speakers that I reviewed, and it's my least favorite speaker. I put an affiliate link up because, listen, you never know. And I'm always very transparent about, I use affiliate links. You know, most of the time it's just generic links, but somebody still bought that speaker, even though I hammered home that this is one of the worst speakers that I've ever heard. So people are going to buy what they want to buy. I know a shop, and the owner told me that the only reason they carry some of those certain speakers and then certain models from other brands is because of nostalgia. People come in and say, you know, my dad had the speaker system in the 70s, and I really just want to relive that. So I want that thing.
And that's okay. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, you know, going to the Klipsch heritage line in general, you know, Danny's here. Say hi to Danny from GR Research.
Oh, what's up, Danny? How you doing, man?
Hope to have Danny on one night, but
that'd be cool.
You know, looking at like Danny tearing those speakers apart, your review, I mean, it's not really promising to look at it. You know, Klipsch is probably going to send a hitman for me, but they look like a high school shop class project. You know what I mean? The build, yeah. But you know, but there's a charm and a nostalgia, and people like that sound, and that's okay.
Right.
You know,
right. Yeah. And I will say too that, you know, there's a handful of speakers from Klipsch that I don't care for, but then there's other speakers from Klipsch that I think are great. Like their RP 500, 600 M2. They have great directivity, you know, like, so there's good things about the 5s, the 7s, the 9s are all really good speakers. So it's not, that's another thing about, you know, if you talk about just a brand, even within the brand, there are different models that are going to have different sound characteristics, and you may hate one and you may really love the other one.
Well, it's the shape and the size, the driver configuration,
all of that stuff.
Where they're mount on wall, bookshelf. There's a lot of differences that dictate that. You know, one thing I wanted to clear the air with you tonight, because, you know, I'm connected to the old school audiophile community. I still like good cables. You know, I'm not you got a, you know, $30,000 cables. I'm not a snake oil guy.
Yeah, no, I hear you there.
Listen, if you're buying a badass setup and you want to put some nice, fat, beautiful cables on it within reason, and some lifters to get them off the floor because it looks cool, why not? I'm not going to beat you up, but there's kind of been a toxic nature, and I think you're misunderstood because you give objective data, right? You just do, and you give your subjective opinion on it. You know, now if a speaker is really bad, you'll say it, and that's okay.
Yeah,
you know,
for sure.
Like some recent ones that you've done, a bad speaker is a bad speaker,
right?
But if a speaker has a dip or null or whatever that makes that, you're not. I've never seen you beat somebody up. You know, I love Focal speakers. You're not a big fan of them, and that's okay. You know, I dig them. My hearing's different a little bit than yours. You know, and now you guys got me all screwed up with the placebo and the effect of looking at the speakers, and
Oh
I don't
yeah,
know which way's
100%.
up, because I'm sitting here looking at my speakers every night going, it sounds amazing. Those things
Yeah,
are
just
badass.
looking
Looking
at the
at your,
speaker alone can make you
oh, dude,
excited
I'm looking at
and
these
make you.
Arendals going, these
Oh,
things are
100%. Yeah, yeah, for
badass.
sure. That's a huge factor. And that's the other
So
thing
what?
about all this stuff too is that, you know, like I've discussed this recently as well. I think on a live stream is I talked with some guys last year at Expona, 3 of them, and they're all very well-to-do guys, and they were hanging out together, and one of them recognized me, so we started chit-chatting. And at some point, you know, we kind of broached the topic of spending a lot of money on speakers and where that divide is between the sound quality and the aesthetic. And they were kind of all in agreement that, you know, if one speaker looks a lot better and another speaker, you know, sounds a lot better, well, for their case, they're going to kind of give the edge to the one that looks a lot. I mean, assuming that it doesn't sound like garbage, right? But
Right, right.
the both
Mhm.
of them are kind of close. Maybe this other one sounds like 20% better, but this other one looks 20% better. Then they're going to go with the one that looks better, and then they're cool with that. So that's another aspect too that, you know, the objective data will tell you the overall performance for comparison purposes, but it can't make that final purchase decision for you.
And there's a lot of good speakers out there, and also, Aaron, you know, there's a factor of, with modern electronics, you know, there's you know, room EQs, you know,
Uh-huh.
you've got different systems, Dirac and Odyssey and a multitude of others. You
Mhm.
can treat the room and overcome some of these problems. Tonality, how do you
Yeah.
explain tonality to people? You know, that's something nobody's really dove into.
Yeah. So I don't know if how I would describe it really answers the question,
It's
but
hard. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, for me, you know, just years of being a judge and IASCA and Mecca and things like that for the car audio side, you really like you're judging by a judge sheet, right? It's subjective, but it's trying to be as objective as it can be because you basically got like placeholders and you say, well, the tonality for the lows sounds, I'm gonna give it a score of 5 out of 6 or something like that, you know, and you build a baseline based on a reference. And ideally, you have a couple different references that are known linear speakers, but
Mhm.
maybe not the exact same speaker. Because if you do just one, then your reference is just that one. I think really having maybe 2 or 3 good known references is ideal if you're making judgment calls on another speaker. Um, but yeah, so through doing all that judging, you get to the point where you recognize tracks extremely well. You don't have to use objective measurements. You can say, yeah, this bass note doesn't sound, and I do everything really based relatively, not on absolute. So I won't judge a speaker and say that there's this sound only, but I judge it based on like, hey, the mid range sounds low in level compared to the treble, and I know it shouldn't be that way. Or this bass note at 69 hertz doesn't sound at the same level as the one at 132 hertz. And I know by looking through Audacity and looking at the spectrum plot that they're within a decibel of each other, right? So these are known things, and you can do that. So when I describe tonality or the way a speaker sounds, I use those kind of terms. I'll say, you know, it sounds like maybe the speaker's warm, and I associate with that with a certain response profile, or maybe the speaker's bright, and I have response profiles in my head of what that is. And I try to relay that to people who are watching the channel. And really, that's the only way I know to do it, other than here's the objective data, right? And it kind of goes back to what I was saying about producers and engineers. If you go and look at this stuff like via Google, you'll see that there's all these things out there, these lists. Hey, if you want to do this thing, it's, you know, boost 600 hertz. If you want this to sound this way, cut 1200 hertz. So,
You know, the audio business in general has really transformed in the last, you know, 15 years. So you used to be able to go into a hi-fi store, listen to a product, and I even warned people back then, you're going into a room that's set up, it's different than your room. You know, electronics might be different. You could get a really good idea of how it sounds. It's like going to an audio show. You get a little taste, like the Borenson speakers.
mhm,
I've heard of audio shows. I've never lived with them. I like the way they sound. I mean, we talked about that before, especially their
right.
big flagships. But you know, looking at your measurements, it was kind of a disaster a little bit. So I'm, well, you know what I mean? So then I'm like,
Yeah,
well,
no,
what
I
the
hear
hell's the
you. I
matter
hear
with
you.
me? But you know, I'm in an audio show in a crowded room. But the way we buy speakers has changed a lot. There are some audio stores like the one you had the event with a couple weeks ago,
Mhm.
where you got some professionals. The problem is those are kind of dying. Really, the only way to know is to get a speaker home,
Yeah.
set it up in your room, and listen to it. That's why I commend companies like SVS and Arendal, who have like generous return policies where they'll send you speakers, and if you don't like them, you can send them back. That's really cool. That's the way to know. You can do all the homework in your world, maybe get a speaker and not really be that crazy about it. So I mean that's changed a lot. And then you've got all the YouTubers out there, and there's really good ones out there, and it's pretty, good camera work and well-produced videos does not say that you're giving the best advice in the world. I would say seek out people that have experience and have heard hundreds of speakers, over a period of time. So a lot of people have asked me, like, what is a Klippel machine? Like, can you give like the elevator pitch on what the Klippel is?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to do it is for proper speaker measurements, you want to measure the speaker itself. You don't want to measure the speaker and the room, right? So when you do an RTA, you're measuring the speaker and the room, and you're trying to correct ideally, you're trying to just correct for the room. But what most people wind up doing is they go full 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz where they're trying to correct the speaker and the room. Okay. So if you want to know what the speaker's doing, you've got to take the room out of the equation. And that's where anechoic chambers come in. And anechoic means without echo. And so without echo means without reflection. So you're only getting just the actual response of the speaker. And to build a true profile of what the speaker is going to do in a room, you have to measure at all sorts of angles. You don't point the mic just at the front of the speaker and take one measurement and call it a day. That's never good enough, because you can have a speaker that performs extremely well on axis, flat as a board, but then the crossover really sucks. And if you go 30 degrees to the side, there's a huge dip in the crossover region and a rebound in the lower treble region. And then that's reflected off the walls. So when we put the speaker in the real room, everything, is not as good as you thought it was based on just the one on-axis measurement. So when you measure the speaker in an anechoic chamber, you take the room out of it. That gives you an idea of what the speaker itself is doing. So an engineer who is designing the speaker will use those measurements. And then I think it's very important for someone like me or other reviewers to also either create those measurements themselves or have access to those kind of measurements so they can share with the audience what the speaker itself is doing. And we know, and the common theme from a lot of subjective only reviewers, and I'm not crapping on subjective only reviewers. I've got friends who review that way, and I like these guys. But what I see with some certain figureheads is that their retort against being objective oriented or using objective measurements at all is, well, everybody's room sounds different. So how can you expect measurements to tell you everything? My response to that would simply be, then why are you even bothering? Because your audience isn't listening to the speaker in your room with your ears, right? So that kind of falls flat on its face when people use that. I've segued a little bit. Yeah, we can come back to that. But essentially what the near-field scanner does, the Klippel near-field scanner, is a robotic device that spins around the speaker. It's got a microphone on a boom, and it measures the speaker at all different positions in space. And then through math, it rebuilds the sound profile of the speaker. So you can basically say, I want to know what the speaker's response is going to be 30 degrees off to the side, 20 degrees up at 100 meters away, and it will build that for you. Now, it doesn't have the air coefficient, which for a room doesn't freaking matter, right? But for a live venue where you have humidity and things of that nature, yeah, sure, it matters then. But yeah, it basically allows you to replace an anechoic chamber, because anechoic chambers, I'm not an authority on price. I just kind of have a general idea that a standard anechoic chamber that will measure down to about 100 hertz or so is going to cost you probably millions of dollars, maybe if not more. And if you want to measure down to 20 hertz fully anechoic, I think there may be just a handful of those in the entire world because of how expensive they are. And then the Klippel allows you to get down to 20 hertz fully anechoic. So you can see this is what the speaker's doing. And then off of all the responses that you're able to capture, you can build a profile for understanding, all right, this is how the speaker is going to sound in a room for comparative purposes. And once you put the speaker in the room below about 400 or 500 hertz, the mid bass, the bass region, that shifts dramatically because of the room itself, the size, the position of the speakers, etc. But what I've found is the estimated in-room response that is built off the anechoic data, which is a function of the CTA 2034 data set, is pretty dang precise above about 500 hertz. Like, it's within a decibel, maybe 2 decibels. And if you're talking about a prediction, that's incredible to have that kind of accuracy with just a prediction. And so that also allows you to determine, yeah, this speaker on axis looks good, but it's ballooning a lot off axis. And by ballooning, I mean, as the midwoofer starts to radiate higher in frequency, its directivity becomes more narrow. So it's basically focusing in on the higher frequencies. Well, now you bring a tweeter in, and that tweeter at low frequency is spreading out wide, and then it narrows at higher frequency.
Right.
So essentially what you have is you have wide at low frequency for the bass, and then narrow for the mid range, and then the tweeter comes in and it's wide again. And the way that that's reflected is the wider frequencies are reflected off the wall, the narrow ones are not. So when you put the speaker in the room that behaves like that, what you're going to typically wind up with is a nice slope in the room until the lower treble, and then the lower treble comes in and it's really wide. It hits the side walls, reflects back at you. There's a bump in that lower treble. And in that case, you can't just EQ that out, because now you're changing the reflected sound and the directed sound. And there's no way you can isolate just one or the other. And so in that case, the best thing you could do is build some panels and put some panels on the sidewalls and capture those reflections. But sometimes that alone doesn't do the job well enough. And that's why data is really helpful to have, because you can say, this speaker is going to perform well in my room. It's highly reflective, and I don't have the means to put up panels, or I can put a panel up and I should be able to take care of this 4K off axis sharpness that's coming from this reflection.
Very cool. And there's a lot of factors. So basically it's a blend of subjective measurements that give you an idea of how that speaker in theory will behave. I mean, it'll give you a pretty accurate idea of it. And then, you move it into the room. Like when I do my reviews of speakers, just things I've learned, I try to do my reviews by putting the speakers. I have 4 systems, and I try to put them in at least 3 of those rooms and run them in different configurations, crossed over with subs, without subs. Right. That gives me a pretty good idea, because they do really respond. How close should you put them to the wall?
Oh,
and that's
100%.
something it's a huge deal. And also things that, going back to the old school audiophile, where you position the speakers, accurately measuring the distance from the wall, making them even, and then towing them in. I have a system that I use that Peter McGrath years ago taught me. You put them off access, you listen, you turn them a little bit, you listen, you turn them a little bit, and until you find that sweet spot. You play music at the same level, and you play the same music, preferably music that you're familiar with. So there's a lot of synergy that goes into it. You're given data, objective data for measurements that help people make decisions, but then there's a lot of other factors that go into that. And you've given them what they have. It's up to them to move that forward, I think. And you talk about that a lot,
Yeah, I think, the thing that really trips me up is that, and it's said by people who are just really against measurements. And I'm thinking, like, I don't understand why, because certainly from room to room, the response is going to vary, but it's predominantly in the upper mid bass, lower mid bass, and sub bass region where the response varies. From like the mid range and up, it's pretty much the speaker. From the mid range and below, it's pretty much the room that you're listening to, right? So at least you can have 50 or 60 or 70% of the equation worked out where, all right, I know this speaker is going to have this kind of tonal balance in my room. And now it's up for me to figure out how to fix the problem with the room itself, right? Either through bass traps or EQ or something like that. But I keep going back to, if you use this stuff in comparative terms, then as a consumer, you can say, well, this speaker has lower bass extension, and that's what I really want. And if I'm putting these speakers in the same place, then I'm going to get the one that looks like it's better suited for what I need, right? And you may not need a speaker that goes that low because you're going to use subwoofers. So you're thinking, hey, I'm going to get extra sensitivity from the speaker that doesn't go as low, and that's what I want, because now I can use a subwoofer for it.
Yeah, it's funny. Matt Pose.
Yeah,
I've done some theater rooms and some projects with Matt, and he really educated. Bringing me out of the old school, a lot of old school knowledge and really understanding. For years when we did commercial speakers, they came with like a book of measurements, and like they would tell you dynamic capability and whatnot. You just don't see that much in
the consumer side
or consumer grade.
Yeah.
How would one test like dynamic capability other than a potentially damaging like compression test? I mean,
so the way I do it, and listen, somebody may disagree with me, and that's fine, but I can say that I got the thumbs up from Greg Timbers years ago. Greg Timbers is a JBL guy who designed pretty much the majority of your favorite JBL speakers, even as recently as JBL 4367, which is one of my all-time favorites. He reached out to me a few years ago and said, "Hey, I saw your website and I saw this review and I see how you measured the dynamic range of the speaker. I think that's really clever." So I'm patting myself on the back to say to anybody who thinks that that's not good enough, well, I got his thumbs up and seal of approval. So that's really all I need. And the way that I test that, and I could change this and I could see it being changed a little bit, but the way I test it is to measure the frequency response at 76 decibels, and then I increase the output to 86 decibels, 96 decibels, and then 102 decibels. So that gives me 10, 20, and 26 decibels of dynamic range testing, right? And anything in between is just, hey, it's too much effort to test every single decibel step. But the idea is that you compare each test to the original one. So you compare 86 decibels to 76, you compare 96 to 76, 102 to 76, and you see, is the frequency response changing? In a perfect world, a speaker that has excellent dynamic range is not going to change in response from low volume to high volume. But in the real world, what you typically wind up with is a speaker that starts to fall apart around 96 decibels, give or take, at 1 meter. Now, these are anechoic measurements, so it's not factoring in room SPL, room gain, things of that nature, or the additional 6 decibels you get when you add another speaker and power that other speaker, okay? But in doing so, I think that's a good way to test for the actual dynamic range of the speaker. Is it? And then one way you can listen for this is pick a track that has low bass, right? And normally it's going to be in rap. If you hate rap, that's cool. Find something else. But find you something that gets to at least 50 hertz in bass capability, and listen at low volume and see what you think about the bass output relative to the mid range, and then turn the volume up and see if the mid range is getting louder, but the bass maybe is not keeping up with it. And that's an indication of a speaker that has low dynamic range. And I'm not even factored in the Fletcher Munson equal loudness contours because it doesn't matter for this particular part of the conversation. So yeah, anyway, that's how I test for dynamic range.
Oh,
And then there's
cool.
a couple other metrics that I use too, but that's the main one.
I just want to address the 800-pound gorilla. I think there's been a little bit of toxicity in the industry because, we all know how important the objective measurements are, but a lot of people have run with that and they just like beat people up. You come out, you're like,
Right.
oh man, the speaker's great. Oh, where's the measurements and blah, blah, blah. There's
Oh,
no
yeah.
way it could sound that good.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? I mean,
That's not
people
new.
shit on everything because, and I know it's not you. I've
Yeah.
watched you close. I mean, and I wanted to clear the air with you tonight that so people know you don't do that. You absolutely don't do that.
Yeah, I was saying that's not new. I think because measurements have been around for a long time. It's not like I've been born in this. I'm not like Bane where I was born in the darkness or anything. But certainly I've talked to some guys who've been doing this for a lot longer than I have, and measurements go back to the 70s, right? And gosh, I can't remember his name now. But anyway, so there's people who've been publishing measurements. I think what's really happened is that recently there's more people providing measurements, whereas there used to be just one source. Like for the longest time, was it Julian Hirsch was doing them?
Yeah.
And then Gene was doing them. Doug Schneider at Soundstage was doing them. But it's really like there's only
was doing it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Of course, I can't forget him.
Right.
But there's really only been like a couple people doing it at the same time, at least on the large scale. And then with the advent of YouTube, there's maybe been a couple doing it there too. Ron at New Record Day is an example, but it's not really been pushed to the forefront. So that's really what I wanted to make my goal. And then obviously like Gene is still doing it, right? Then you've got Amir at ASR who's doing it. And I'm sure there are others that I'm forgetting right now. And I hope they don't, send me a message after this and say, how dare you forget me? But Joe and Tell, my buddy Joe at Joe and Tell has been doing measurements on his YouTube channel. Matter of fact, Joe and Ron were really inspiring to me because I was like, oh, people are actually doing measurements here. That's cool. But I can do my own thing with it. Anyway, so I think a lot of it is now measurements are really being pushed toward the forefront and it's gaining more ground than subjective only. The part I don't like is the divide between the community. And I will take some fault for that as well, because when I first came on, I was so aggravated at all the BS that I was seeing spewed. Like there was one guy who said this clip speaker, you didn't need a subwoofer with it. Well, the sucker starts rolling off at 100 hertz, right? Like objectively. And when I listened to it, I was like, what the hell is he talking about? And not to mention,
gain.
I was like, oh yeah, there's tons of room gain. Anyway, the guy who loaned me the speakers to review actually bought them because of that other guy's review. And he said, I don't understand how he's hearing what he's hearing. I would be really interested to see what the measurements are showing. So I measured them and then I did my review on that. So I think there's a problem with the community where it's people feel like they have to take one side or the other. It's like politics, you know,
just like
and
politics
and
or football or
unfortunately, there's a lot of uninformed people at the extremes, like the guys who are diehard measurements don't matter and it only matters what I hear in my room. Like they don't have a clue how to take a measurement. They don't know how to read a measurement. And then you've got the objectivist guys who think subjective opinions completely don't matter at all. And it's like, are you even going to listen to the speaker when you put it in the room, or are we just going for, you know, eye candy in terms of graphs? So there's those extremes. But you and I talked about this the other day when I said the majority of speakers that are out there are good speakers. There's some that really suck, and there's some that are really awesome. And that's really no different than the people that make up this audio hobby, this community. Is a lot of people are really great and they're interested in knowing both sides and having an understanding. And then there's the extremes where you're like, dude, stay away from me. I don't want to be associated with that mess.
I do. And I hate that because it's taken some of the love and the passion out of the business. I mean, I think there's a place for both. I think scientific objective measurements are important. And I'm super glad. I think that this is kind of causing speaker companies to ship shape, you know what I mean? To snap to attention. Whereas before, you know, there's always been measurements and you can't build a speaker without being able to measure it. I mean, I guess you could, but
sometimes I think people do, but yeah, I hear you.
Well, for sure.
Yeah.
I think aesthetics are important because I mean, bottom line is it's two big lumps, even if it's bookshelves, it's furniture in your room. So you want to like how it looks, you know, you want it to be a conversation piece. But you know, and I understand some of the old school 2-channel guys, you know, they're all listening to horns now, which I'm not a fan of horn speakers. I've heard some that I liked. Just something about the sound, man. But that's me. Who am I to tell you not to buy a speaker? As a reviewer and a professional who sells and installs audio equipment on a daily basis, you know, like what you like. I mean, there's enough information out there to do that. You know, I was on Reddit the other day and just wasting time. And
all right.
This guy was looking at what? You all right?
I was just thinking you're on Reddit. Woo.
Well, I did.
Reddit's a rabbit hole, man.
Yeah. Well, you think?
Yeah.
ADHD. I had to take some Adderall.
Oh yeah, man. The stuff I come up with an hour after being on Reddit, I'm like, what?
Because you just go in all these veins, man. Next thing you know, you're looking at cold air intakes for your truck. Then, you know, 20 minutes later, you're looking at UFO evidence, dude. It's crazy.
And you're convinced of it too. Yeah.
So this guy was looking at and I'm going to use it, Focal Canta number 2s, which I own, right?
Yeah.
I know it's a great speaker. I love the way it sounds.
They look awesome.
They look great. And, you know, it might not be perfect measuring, but to me, I love the sound.
Mm-hmm.
I've had my hearing tested, which I think everybody in the hobby should do. Yeah. I know my limitations. Right. I love the sound. I love the look. And this guy's on there just asking questions to people. And I didn't comment. But this other guy comes on and he just like, blah, 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 you know, objective listening and, you know, blah, 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 the placebo effect. And, you know, you should buy the Rebels because the Rebels, you know, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, what a dick. Like just killing this guy out instead of having a debate and talking to him. I love the Rebels too. I wouldn't kick either one of them out of bed, but you know, to kill this guy's jam. I think that's toxic in the industry, and it goes a long ways because what I found, and it's not just this, it's other hobbies and things I'm into.
Yeah.
People buy on the opinions of others
and
then fiercely defend their purchase, even when faced with subjective evidence of the contrary.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to think they made the right decision and what they bought is the end all.
Yeah.
And that's 100%. Human nature. And
that's a big deal too. I mean, I've had people reply and say, "Oh, I'm unsubscribing because I reviewed a speaker and I didn't like it." And it's there, you know, I think I've heard somebody say this before, so this is not my idea at all, but I think the majority of people who come to watch reviews or read reviews are doing so to see like what somebody thinks of something they've already bought. A lot of the times, or maybe it's just entertainment, or in my case, I think more of my views are kind of based on people who are just curious about the objective performance, and they don't even pay attention to what I say subjectively. Like they're just like, I don't care what you say. I'm going to look at the data, and that's fine. That's your bag.
I mean, privately, I won't do it publicly, but there's a list of influencers, people that I respect that really dig down deep, like James Larson's. I mean, Danny gets all up in them guts on everything, like I think they're, I like Jay Yagi. I think he does a great job. Jay, he gets a ton of grief, man. Everything's great. Well, dude, he reviews some badass speakers. So what? I mean, Gene, the audio godfather, I named him that, he's always been a measurement guy. But, going back to Gene, like recently, Gene, I'm reviewing an amp and I give it to Gene, and he has the Klippel version, the audio precision machine for amps.
Right.
And he's an electronic engineer from the aerospace industry. And that's powerful. And he measured this amp that I have that's supposed to be 400 watts a channel and 800. And whatever reason, and I just said to him, Gene, do me a solid, bro. Because I hooked this thing up at my house and it was badass. I mean, it was a monster, dude.
Mm-hmm.
But he's like, it's only 200 watts a channel. I'm like, damn, I couldn't believe it. So he hooked it up and he called me. He's like, bro, this thing sounds great. It's got all kinds of power.
Yeah.
And then he did a little video, and that's cool. We need more of that in this business. Hey, I did this objectively, but then when I subjectively hooked it up, it sounded great. I think there should be more of that in this industry. I really do.
Well, personally, I'm more interested, like you said that you were talking about horn speakers and how you don't necessarily care for them. And so when people say those kind of things, or they talk about, I heard this thing, I don't really even doubt that they heard the thing. I immediately go to, well, why? Like, why do you? And so is there data that kind of backs it? So I'm thinking, like, you're talking about horn speakers. I wonder if it's because most of them are pretty narrow compared to standard tweeters on a flat baffle or something like that. Like, that's the first thing I think of. And I think if people maybe approached it from that perspective, rather than just saying, there's no way you heard this thing, then that makes more sense. And the other stuff that, talking about cables and stuff like that. Yeah. That's the one area where I'm like, oh God, here we go.
Don't touch.
Yeah.
Don't touch.
I'm just like,
Don't
oh
touch.
God, here we go, but like you said a minute ago, I like good cables. Like, I've got Amazon cables. I've got other high end. Well, I don't know if they're high end, but they're well-made cables. I used to make all my own cables. So the thing that I like about a good cable is that it feels good and it doesn't feel cheap or crappy, and especially like RCAs. If I want a good pair of RCAs, sometimes I really want to twist them and put them into a tight position or something.
Good connectors.
Right. You need good connectors.
Like
I like locking connectors as well. As long as I can get to it to loosen it up, which in car audio, I learned that lesson early on. If you
monster cable turbine connectors, remember those? You're like, even half your amp or your
exactly
pulls out. You're like,
exactly. The whole amp board just rips out of the chassis. Yeah. So there's a lot of room for, I don't want to say subjectivist and objectivist. I think there's just a lot of room for people to share the passion, regardless of like which way you lean. I don't think many people luckily lean so far on the other side, but there's a lot of people that, in my experience, well, I won't say a lot of people. The majority of the people who are really die hard one way or the other don't want to seem to come off of it, but they also get a lot of stuff wrong, And it kind of goes back to like the hardcore subjectivists that think measurements don't matter at all. They'll always say, well, I heard the speaker and it measured flat and I hated the way it sounded. It's like, yeah, it measured flat in your room. That's not the same thing as flat anechoic, and flat in your room is going to sound like ass. So that's why, but that's the part of me that is curious. Like, okay, well, what speaker was it? Show me those measurements and let's talk about it. And then let's make sense of it. And now you're informed. And if you want to go buy another speaker later, you have an idea of what to look for. Like, that's the cool part,
Only the Sith deal in absolute. So let me temper what I said earlier.
Okay.
Mostly I don't like horn or compression driver speakers based on years and years, because there was most of those were just commercial derived speakers, and they tended to lean on the harsh side a lot. However, I have had speakers in my home. I had some JBL synthesis arrays, which are a little older. They didn't sound like compression driver speakers. They were full. They were rich. The highs weren't piercing. I've listened to JTR speakers, Jeff speakers that use a compression mid-range and tweeter.
Yeah,
they were very, 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 very good. I mean, I really enjoyed the sound of them. It's a little different, but And then I've done a bunch of theaters and heard a bunch of rooms where you've got compression driver bass speakers, which makes a lot of sense on a big room, filling it with sound, trying to get the dynamics because they're very, very efficient.
Yeah.
I've heard them EQ'd, and I've heard them in acoustically treated rooms where they sounded wonderful.
Yeah.
My thing is, like, for the most part, I don't really particularly care for that sound unless it's really well done, you know, as compared to a normal dynamic speaker. I love electrostatic speakers. If you're in a 3 foot wide space or 2 foot wide space, and you got, you know, exactly from the wall, and you put a thing for your head doesn't move.
Yeah.
Magical.
Head tracking is what you need. Yeah. You need like
you need, dude. Ooh, we could do that and sell it to Martin Logan. Wow.
Yeah, good. Well, just team up the bot guys with Martin Logan. There you go. But yeah, you know, the ironic thing that I've come across from time to time is in discussions about horn speakers. It's very interesting because I've seen this on like the Steve Hoffman forums and some other places where people will say, well, I don't like horn speakers because they don't sound lively enough. And then somebody will say, hold up, horn speakers don't sound lively enough. But if you pay attention to the words that they're using, what they're describing seriously is it's not enveloping enough. So again, because most horn speakers are more narrow, right? Like in general, I would say that horn speakers are about plus or minus 30 to 40 degrees at their negative 6 dB point. So if you go off axis, they've lost 6 decibels of output compared to on axis by the time you hit 30 degrees to either side or 40 degrees to either side. Whereas like a typical dome tweeter with a cone mid-range, you're looking at 60 degrees or so, like plus or minus 60 degrees to either side. So there's more spread with those, and therefore there's more sense of envelopment. And I can relate to that. I mean, my previous home theater setup that I built myself, all DIY, which, listen, if you ever saw it, you'd be like, good God, Aaron, we've got to do something about this. But it worked, and everything was hidden because the whole wall was covered in black grill cloth. Okay, so it worked. But that used pro audio drivers from a theater in town, from the Carmike in town. When they closed down, long story short, I got a hold of their 15-inch bass bins. I turned those into mid-ranges, and I used their 2-inch compression drivers, crossed down to like 500, 600 hertz. That system was stupid loud.
I bet.
But yeah, it wasn't as engaging, I guess, as some of the other speakers that I've heard. And I attribute a lot of that just down to the fact that they didn't radiate as wide as some of these other speakers.
How do you feel about speakers that feature an air motion tweeter? In general.
I don't have any issues with any speaker using any particular component. So I don't care if it has an AMT or a dome tweeter. I don't care if it uses aluminum cone or a paper cone or a poly cone. Like, none of that stuff bothers me. To me, it's the final product, right? So I think a good example is this whole paper cone versus aluminum cone. And everybody, not everybody, but people will say, well, the aluminum cones always sound XYZ to me. And it's like, something analytical, and it's like, I guarantee you that if you ABX'd a properly integrated aluminum cone driver with a properly integrated paper cone driver, you're probably not going to notice the difference. But the key is it's got to be integrated well. So if you use an aluminum cone driver that has a high breakup mode at, like, let's say it's a 6.5-inch midwoofer, it's going to start breaking up around like 4K or so. Usually it's like double the beaming point. So, and it's in that ballpark. It's not exact, but it's in that ballpark. So it's going to have like a plus 10 to 15 decibel breakup mode at 4K, and then some other ones. And that means that the off-axis response is going to go just to dog shit, right? Versus a paper cone that might have its first breakup mode at like 6K or something like that, and it's not as severe. Okay, so both of them can be made to sound really good, but the integration aspect of it, so you got to put it like a proper notch filter on the aluminum cone. And then on the paper cone, maybe you've got to do something a little bit different in the crossover. But once they're integrated into the system, then you've got a good product. So that's why I don't, and this is from years of experience, like building and tuning active systems, right? I don't build passive systems because I ain't got time for that shit. But active systems, I've always used DSP for that stuff. And doing that, I've learned that, if you properly integrate it and you use equalization to try to tame the driver first, bring those breakup modes down. Certainly there's still going to be some ringing effect, but it should be marginalized to the point that it really doesn't matter. It's so low that you're not going to notice it. Then it's not as big of a deal. But if you're using first order slopes and you're not putting the notch filter in the crossover to mitigate some of these breakups, then you're absolutely going to hear those ringing differences. You're going to hear these issues, right? So it's not just the products that or the parts that are being used, it's the parts of the whole or the sum of the holes or something like that. Whole of the sum. Anyway,
some of the holes.
yeah, something like
some
some holes.
All about the holes.
Yeah.
I agree with you because listen, like right now in my house, I have aluminum drivers. I've got, multi flaxseed drivers, and I've got every kind of driver. I've got, AMTs. I've got tweeters. A manufacturers like to come out and the new Sound 3000 with unobtainium tweeters and verbinium drivers, and and you get like a MoFi with a paper driver that's going old school. It sounds great. It's the application. It's the 100%. It's the crossover.
Yeah.
It's the cabinet is super crucial. Right. Absolutely super crucial. Is the cabinet like a brick? Is it heavy? So there's a lot of factors that go in, and people tend to hyper focus, I think, on a technology like beryllium tweeters is all I listen to. Or a guy the other day going, I can't get behind metal drivers and tweeters. They just ring. I'm like, do they? Like, really?
Yeah.
But
I think a lot of this stuff is grounded in a truth, but it was the truth 20 years ago.
Yeah,
exactly. So I think that's the problem is people are still holding on to the people who say those things are still holding on to something that was true, but not really so much anymore. And you bring up a really good point. Something I'm kind of curious about from time to time is before I go to but when I'm sitting down to do my review and I'm collecting not just the data, but like the parts information and stuff like that, I'll go to the manufacturer's website and I'll look at their spec sheet, and it's got this sensitivity, it's got this size midwoofer, it's made from this, blah, blah, blah. And I'll look at it, I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And I just haphazardly look at it and I'll read it off the screen or whatever. Honest to goodness, I have never in the past, because I used to deal with DIY systems all the time, and I got so jaded. Like, it didn't matter what the component was made from and all that stuff. It mattered what the final product was. Now, as a DIYer, you care about what the component is made from, right? So if you are limited on cost or space, then you're not going to be able to build like a super duper crossover to take care of a lot of issues in the driver. So you have to say, well, I need a driver that has low breakup modes. Maybe I can get away with a more shallow slope with this particular driver than I could another one, but there's always other things that you have to fight against too. And ultimately, I didn't really even care so much about, as a reviewer, the components that are used, right? So I'm just wondering, does the audience really care that this thing is using super ultra vibranium? You know what I'm saying?
No, I do.
Do they care? Because I don't care. I care about the final product.
I mean, you get a little bias. Like, I've even had companies come out with like paper drivers and soft dome tweeters. You're like, oh, that's 2002, but they sound great. Like, it's the synergy, the quality of the driver. The material is important to a point, but that shouldn't be a driving factor. We could go on all night. Promise me you'll come back and we can
100%
address some other subjects and enjoy it. But, I think I would like to close this with advice from both of us. I would say, if you're going to be in this hobby and you're going to spend money, look at data, look at multiple sources. Don't join a cult. Don't just buy because I say it's good. For God's sake, don't buy it because Aaron says it's good.
Absolutely not. No, don't trust a word I say.
Absolutely. Listen to different people. Take everything with a grain of salt from everybody, and listen. Go, like, if you're going to buy, with these Arndals, which I love. I mean, I've made it no secret. I think they're a disruptive. I mean, they're a great speaker for the money. They're fantastic. A lot of technology, well built. And, everybody's on there. Well, the measurement state and this and that, there's no way it could do this. I'm like, dude, have you heard them? I tell you what, I opened my house up Friday. I'm opening my house up. Anybody that wants to come, I'll give you a glass of wine. I'll give you something to eat. Sit down and listen for yourself. Then you decide. If you don't like them, I don't care. I didn't build them. It's not my design. I mean, I dig them. Is it that big a deal to get a 3-hour drive or a cheap flight to go someplace where you can hear speakers that you might drop 5, 6, 7 large on, or buy something with a return policy if you don't like it, but give it the benefit of the doubt. And this is where people are going to get mad. I believe in speaker break-in. I don't give a shit what anybody says. I know it's real.
God, here we go.
I don't care.
No, I don't care. I broached this topic the other night in my live stream too, because
Did
somebody
you?
straight up asked. Yeah. And my take on it, I won't even say my opinion because I've done this long enough to where I've seen that there can be a difference, but
There is.
I think the difference is, in my experience, the difference with a tweeter and a mid-range is so minimal that I'd really be surprised if you actually noticed a difference. I feel like speakers with larger spiders that are more stiff to begin with, maybe they need a couple pushes.
Yeah,
But
mechanical device.
yeah, I think the interesting thing is I've talked to so many manufacturers over the years, and some have told me, yeah, all you need to do is push in on the cone a couple times, you're good. Some have told me it needs to break in for, hundreds of hours. And the thing that I think is really interesting to consider, and one of my car audio friends brought this up years ago, but he said, so if the speaker has break-in of X, Y, or Z time, then when does it stop breaking in? And does it just continually get worse, or does it like get better?
Out the front?
And then it turns out the other end, like now it's no longer good. Like, how do you know? And he's like, so I thought that was a very interesting way of putting things. But as a reviewer, what I do is I listen to what the manufacturer says. So if they send me something that's brand new, I do what they say to do. And the main reason I do it is because some wise ass is going to say, well, did you break it in? Because blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to say, I did. Next, and keep moving.
Look, I don't die on any hill, dude. When I say I believe speaker break-in, I think it's really something that affects more, mid-range and bass drivers, like you said, not so much the tweeters. I don't necessarily buy into the 200-hour break-in and all that. I think a lot of that might be psychosomatic.
Absolutely.
I
I 100% agree. Yeah.
You get it dialed in, you get it in the right spot. You're like, wow, this thing's really breaking in. But I objectively, or have actually listened and felt like speakers broken. But this is, and you're the same boat. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of speakers over decades,
Yeah.
And I'm a big enough man to admit if I'm wrong, and I might have been, a victim to placebos and all that stuff. But the reality is the reality. What I hear is what I hear. And I'm tired of people telling me I don't, but I think to a point, I think to a point.
No, I hear you.
And, people choose to believe what they want to believe, but really the eyes in the beholder, because you're buying the speaker. Don't buy it because Aaron says it's great. Don't buy it because I say it kicks ass. Don't buy it because, another influencer says it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Buy it because you like it. Do you like the way it looks? Do you like the way it sounds? Have you put it in your room? Does it fit?
Yeah.
Do you have enough amplification? That's another thing that you and I, we'll do another stream on amplification, equalization. Now Aaron's measured in the room. What do you, on the Klippel, what do you do when you put it in the room, Aaron? Like, and I'm not going to open that can of worms tonight because we got to let these people have their evening, but there's a lot of cool things on there. I wanted to have you on because you're my boy and, I enjoy talking to you, but at the same token, I think you've been misunderstood. And I think this is a good platform. Audioholics is a big platform to clear the air. So people, hey, I get it, and keep on doing what you're doing. I still can't hear any damn difference when you do your tones on there. I don't give a shit. I can't. I'm like, let me get the Focal Batin. Oh wait, he doesn't like Focal. Let me get the.
No. I can't say that always because I like the speakers that I heard at your house when we went and demoed those.
Remember,
those were good.
Your girlfriend and I were half shit faced, so we both really.
Yeah. And I was sitting there like, I think we're all right. And then I heard the RBH.
Like, why don't we have this in our house? I'm like,
yeah.
Why did I not have a camera when she said that?
Yeah, exactly.
I would have blackmailed you. But
I'll just like
we were listening to music in the bedroom, by the way. It was like,
it wasn't awkward at all.
Yeah, not at all.
So the speaker break in real fast. Let's just say that it depends, and that's the honest to God truth, because everybody wants to say, well, either it doesn't exist or it does exist, or one of the two, right? But it depends. Like pretty much every single thing that I've ever come into contact with in my life, like my day job. Hey, why isn't this thing working? Well, it depends, because if this thing happens, then this thing and this thing. So speaker break-in, the answer to that is it depends. Why are you measuring it? So we talk about subwoofers, modeling for an enclosure, right? So you probably need to break in a little bit, let the till small parameters change a little bit. But ultimately, and even Vance Dickinson says this, who is like the loudspeaker guru, it's a wash, because the parameters change in a way that the enclosure size doesn't really change. And then, like you were saying too, about don't just listen to me. Don't just listen to you. I highly encourage people to, if you're going to use the data in a way to help you inform your decision, use it to help you narrow down a couple, maybe 2, 3, or 4, and go to your local shop and ask if you can demo them there. If you can, if you don't have a local shop, you've got outlets like Crutchfield or Audio Advice and the other outlets that you can buy something and you can return it when you, let's say you didn't like this other thing, but try them in your room. And the reason for that is, even if you can read the measurements as well as I can after doing this for so long, you may still be surprised that there's a trade-off that you didn't expect that you would be okay with taking. And you want to go with a different speaker than maybe the measurements alone would have led you. So let the measurements guide you to a pool and then pick from that pool.
That dude, I got to tell you from the heart, that was great advice, because I don't know about you, but I feel pretty blessed that I've been in this industry and, you know, not get kicked out yet, which is close.
Yeah.
And that I have the honor of meeting these manufacturers and speaker designers and, you know, people that are just pioneers in the industry. And really, I'm honored to be able to take all these wonderful speakers and listen to them in my own home and really, you know, to a multitude of amplifiers and really get to know them. Like, you'd never, I don't care what anybody says until you have some at home and you listen to your music at your level and your seat.
Oh, 100%.
That's the sauce. That's the sauce,
dude. That's where we need to start the next time we talk, because I've got so many thoughts on that.
Listen, I've literally been planning an entire video on room lighting, like texture on walls, you know, the comfort level in the room.
Yeah.
I can't listen to, I honestly almost can't listen to music in bright rooms anymore.
Dude,
like, totally sound.
You've got to watch my video that I'm putting out tomorrow, because there's so many things. I've been taking notes. There's so many things you said. I'm like,
videos you talk about this day, dude.
Oh man, you're going to love it, because I talk about one of the easiest ways to improve your stereo is literally close your eyes.
Close your, you know,
close your eyes.
You know, we should get on is Jay. You know, Jay's brilliant. Iagi, and he's got a lot of knowledge in, you know, human physiology and how we perceive things and whatnot. And it's always to get, and plus he's an audiophile. You've seen his room on his videos. His room's killer, dude.
And I like Jay. I respect him. The fact that he's trying to incorporate measurements into it. Like, I'm not saying I didn't respect him before, because I talked to him plenty, but when he started to try to do that, I was like, that's cool. You know, to see somebody who's already established their brand is not based on measurements, but now he's adding that to, you know, to what he's doing. I was like, that's really cool.
He's like a fusion of the old and the new. Like, he's a young guy, and he's all about, you know, the old school audio, because he worked in the high-end audio realm. And you learn a lot when you work in that business.
Yeah, I watched the other channel too.
I sold Wilson, and I sold Lynn, and I sold Levinson and B&Ws, and for years. I mean, I know what really expensive good audio is, and I love what Jay's doing. I think he gets a lot of grief, and I don't know why. People are like, oh, everything he likes, he's a shill. Well, look what he's reviewing killer speakers.
I'm taking more notes, because that's something else we need to talk about too. So
the shill.
Not necessarily. It's just, you know, like some reviewers only review things that they enjoy, and they're public about, like Steve Guttenberg has flat out said, I don't make videos about stuff I don't like. And so how do we feel about that as fellow content creators, and how to, like, as a consumer, how do we feel about that? So I think that's an interesting thing to talk about with you too. So
I mean, you know, as I get deeper into this and my career's starting to grow, I had to take a break from it for about a year, but you know, I'm sure there's going to be speakers and equipment that comes across my table that's just not good. Nothing I would put my name on and recommend, you know. I mean, I don't know. I do know about you. I know that you take this very serious. You're an honorable person, and you talk about it. You know, I joke around and sometimes cuss too much, and I'm sorry, because I am a Christian and I apologize. But
you're not going to hell for saying a cuss word, man.
Well, I know, but okay.
I live in the Bible Belt.
Dude, I'm from Kentucky. What are you talking about?
So am I. But I'm in Alabama. Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah. My zip code was EIEIO, dude. I mean, I got web toes, dude. Come on.
You were born in the hollers.
Like on the holler.
In the Harlan County.
You know, the reason that I became friends with Gene and, you know, and have become friends with James Larson's, who everybody respects James. I mean, you got to, you know. I know you do. You said it. And, you know, Teo, Matthew Pose is a genius, and Gene has a lot of integrity. He's just been doing it 25 years, and he makes a living, you know, and that's okay.
Right.
But, you know, integrity is important, and I won't hang out and talk to people who don't have it. And I think you're the same, bro. And I appreciate that. And
Yeah,
I
I
think
appreciate
everybody
that.
else does.
Yeah.
Well,
Good.
guys, I am super, super honored to have Aaron on and look
thank
for
you
more
having
stuff
me.
from him. I'm going to reach out to Danny. Maybe we have Danny on to, clear the air on Danny, in a neutral, format. So nobody's kicking anybody in the teeth. I'm sure there's people going, oh, Aaron's going to get Don tonight, or Don's going to call Aaron out. I'm like, no, dude,
No. Yeah.
Any divergence we have is minor,
Yeah, I would hope so.
And oh, absolutely, dude. Absolutely. So guys, if you like this content, please check out Audioholics on Patreon at Patreon.com/Audioholics. Please hit that subscribe button. Smash that subscribe button.
Smash that subscribe button.
Smash that subscribe button. And guys, thank you so much. The greatest gift you can give is your time. And, cash deposits are good too. So I'm just saying,
helps.
But I appreciate all of you. Love you. Until next time, keep listening.
All right. Peace. See y'all.